name of the session is Leaders and Laggards, and we decided we want to do this session because the Resource Centre is committed to trying to ensure that businesses bring human rights right to the very core of their business model. And that's as true for issues of conflict minerals as it is for surveillance and privacy issues on the internet. We are committed to, as an organisation, transparency, building transparency, of building also accountability of companies, but also in terms of empowerment and providing a platform for many organisations around the world through our website for their own involvement in business and human rights. We've just put out a briefing on Friday which is explicitly about the experience of many of our partners around the world who are struggling on business and human rights, particularly in the area of internet freedom. And obviously from our perspective now, what we'd like to do is move into a session which is looking at critical questions that are with us today about, first of all, how do we get some of the largest and most powerful companies in the world to really start to take leadership on putting the human rights relating to the internet at the centre of their business model. For instance, in terms of the area of the Dodd-Frank bill, which went through, where certain organisations, including Microsoft, but also GE and Motorola, stepped forward, stepped out of line with the rest of the Chamber of Commerce of the United States and backed the Dodd-Frank bill and the conflict minerals issue. How do we make sure that they move also, as Yahoo did after its catastrophic passing of information to the Chinese government, and instead went to some collective action with other companies to create the GNI? How do we make sure that those companies take leadership in terms of privacy, in terms of justice, the freedom of expression, the freedom of association? How do we shift those companies that don't see human rights as central to their mission, as central to their model, and particularly the laggards who see actually that human rights have no place in their business model and refuse to even consider the opportunity of putting human rights in their business model? How do we make sure that those companies feel both encouraged, cajoled and pressured to ensure that they do start to behave in a moral and a way that is going to deliver long-term sustainability for their business, but also freedom of expression and freedom of association? And of course, how do we take on that enormous challenge of mass surveillance and metadata collection that you've heard about in the previous session? So we've got a panel with us, and the panel is made up, first of all, of Sana Salim, who comes from Bolo B, a partner of ours, but a very important organisation in Pakistan. And Sana has been at the very centre of the work regarding the censorship of the internet in Pakistan. We've got also Carly Neist from Privacy International, doing incredibly important work on the whole issue of mass surveillance. We've got Ron Dieber from Citizen Lab. And Ron, of course, with his team, have been absolutely central to the way in which we understand who is doing what on the internet in terms of the mechanics of gaining access to that mass surveillance by governments. And he's been working very closely with Bolo B and the other organisations in Pakistan. And then we also have Dan Bross from Microsoft, who is the Vice President for Global Citizenship. I wish, Director. I can never work it. To be honest, I can never really understand the inflation of terms in the United States. But that's another point. So Dan has been tremendously important in driving that leadership in Microsoft on many of the issues that we've been working on. So without further ado, I'd like to just explain the process. The process is, we've tried to define this as a fishbowl. So the opportunity is for you to start to become part of the conversation. Our four speakers will start by making a short intervention themselves of 3 to 5 minutes. There's a spare seat you will see over there. As soon as they've finished their first interventions, you're welcome to come up onto the stage and take that chair. You're then also welcome to come and tap one of them on the shoulder. They've all agreed to remove their egos from the stage. They'll be quite happy to tap on the shoulder, and they'll move to let you into their conversation. So we want the conversation to flow. But we also have Slido, which will allow us to also put any questions that you have up on the screen. So those that feel a little shy about coming on stage are welcome to put their questions up there. But I do encourage you to come up and be part of the conversation. At the end of the session, we'll have 15 minutes where I invite the four speakers to come back on the stage and give their concluding remarks, if you like, their synthetic remarks from the discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to pass on to Sandra.
Thank you, Phil. I'd like to start by first thanking Business Human Rights Resource Center for inviting me here and for making the trip possible. My first interaction with Business Human Rights Resource Center was in 2012, where fortunately for us, and unfortunately for the government of Pakistan floated a public tender in a newspaper calling for people, entrepreneurs, companies, education, academics, researchers, to bid for proposal to build a firewall, a China-like firewall in Pakistan. They called it the National URL Monitoring and Filtration System. And as a reaction to that, we started a campaign, of course, within Pakistan, speaking to academics, speaking to different segments of the government, as well as speaking to civil society groups at home and abroad on how we were going to react to that situation. And initially our first step was to educate and inform policymakers about what the repercussion of such a technology was. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, policymakers still do not have the kind of understanding about technology, especially technology used for censorship. And most of the censorship is covert censorship. Publicly, policymakers will tell you that there is no censorship in Pakistan. They'll tell you that they completely support freedom of expression. There are over 3 dozen news channels with supposedly very free, freedom to express themselves. But what's very common is that there are these red lines within the minds of, say, activists, policymakers, public figures, and even reporters, which they know they're not going to cross. And to make matters worse, censorship is often justified in the name of morality, national security, and much more riskier, blasphemy. At the time in 2012, the excuse was to ban pornography from the internet, which was why the government said they were acquiring such a system. So, being the usual civil society action, we started campaigning to get the government to shelf their plan. But another thing that we attempted to do, which at that point, and I can be honest about it now that's done with, is that we thought that how about we approach international surveillance, Western surveillance companies that sell this technology to other countries and see what their reaction would be. And so it began with a very simple letter to Cisco, Verizon, Sandvine, McAfee, NetSweeper, ZTE, Huawei, telling them that our government has put this proposal forward. This is the history of internet censorship and censorship in Pakistan. There exists no legislation or no policy that can prevent the government from abusing such a technology. And if you do bid for this proposal, you will do so with full knowledge that this will be abused. And it was at that particular point that we got in touch with Business Human Rights Resource Center. And another thing that at a personal level, as an advocate, as somebody who's been a journalist and a blogger, and pretty active on Twitter, is that we often don't like the kind of approach which is sort of systematic or strategic. We just want to sort of shout from the rooftop and get it all sorted. And the one thing that I learned from working with Business Human Rights Resource was that we needed a perfect strategy if we were going to do it well. And so Annabelle, who's here, was my first contact, and we began by sending letters. Well, Business Human Rights Resource Centers began sending letters to these companies. And something that at that particular time did not make much sense to us was that Business Human Rights Resource Center was giving them timelines, 7 days, 8 days for companies to respond. And at that particular time, Cisco has built a firewall in China. Why are we giving them 8 days to make their statement? But after the end, 3 weeks into the campaign, 6 out of the 9 companies that we've written to, including companies like Cisco, had responded with a voicemail or a letter or an email committing that they will not bid for that technology. And I feel that at that particular instance, even though a few months later the government itself decided to shelf the plan, And even at that particular time, I remember celebrating the success of the campaign. We said cautious celebrations because we knew that a few months later, a year later, the government was going to bring in this technology and would do so much more cleverly. But the idea that we had those letters, we still have those commitments, is proof enough and is, I think, a strong strategy point for other civil society organizations around the world working on similar issues to hold these companies responsible. Because at one particular time during our campaign, they had made a public admission that the technology that they are developing could be prone to abuse. And I'll sum it up by just saying that at that time we were thrilled that this has happened. A year later, Citizen Lab published a report showing that NetSweeper was in fact being used in Pakistan. NetSweeper also happened to be the only company that did not give any comment, regardless of voicemails, fax, you have it. We contacted them in every way possible. There were no comments from them. There's still no comments from them so far. And we've written to the Canadian High Commission on NetSweeper's conduct, and we got a really sweet email from the Canadian government reminding us and how they lovingly always support blogger meetups. They're willing to support trainings, and they're the good people. And the bad people are the Pakistani government that needs to be held accountable. So there are lots of, it's a long battle and a long struggle ahead, but there are a few successes, and I hope that more people will use the resource that we created in 2012 to hold these companies accountable.
Thank you, and a very good practical way to start us off, because this session is about how do we do it through case studies, and then we can have some sentences at the end. Ron, straight up.
So thank you for having me on the panel, and I'm glad to be here at RightsCon. I thought I would take a step back and explain our role coming from Citizen Lab in terms of all of this. As Sana mentioned, our report was instrumental in some of the campaigning that was done locally in Pakistan, not just on NetSweeper, but on Gamma Group's FinSpy as well. I don't know if that's me or not. With Citizen Lab, we're based at a university. We're a university research center, and the way we approach this topic is through impartial, evidence-based research. I think we're unique in terms of university research centers in that we're truly interdisciplinary. So we have experts from computer science, engineering, technical forensics, as well as social scientists. And we work a lot with people all over the world. So we have partners not only in Pakistan, but just about every region of the world. And we're not an advocacy group. We're very much about letting the evidence speak for itself. And I think for a while, this was difficult to explain to a lot of people, both outside the university and inside the university. What are you? What exactly is Citizen Lab? And quite frankly, internally as well, it took a while for us to realize what our proper niche is. And I think now the value of taking that position is beginning to pay off. So we've been able to, fortunately, have many very talented people work at Citizen Lab, applying their skills to developing ways in cases like this to fingerprint the actual technologies that are used around censorship and surveillance, and going further, even targeted spyware. And we've released several reports in this area now, and I think the value here is that we can shed light on practices that are going on beneath the surface in a way that's perceived as credible. If you do research and there's evidence that's drawn from methods that are transparent, that are reproducible, that are derived from practices that are very legitimate within each of the disciplines in the university, it's very hard for companies to counter that with rhetoric. So to give you one example, we just released a report on a company based in Milan called Hacking Team that sells spyware to law enforcement intelligence agencies. They claim that they have a due diligence process that restricts sales to prevent their products from ending up in the hands of repressive regimes or regimes that violate human rights. But when we produce our report, I mean, the evidence is just obvious that this is not the case, that those due diligence mechanisms, such as they are, break down. And their response was simply to deny what is plainly evident for anyone who can look at these reports to see. So I think the other thing I will mention is that Citizen Lab has started to partner not only with groups like Bolobi or other Pakistan partners, but partners all over the world, including with Privacy International. And I think there's a really nice fitness in terms of the complementarity of skills. So there's at least one, maybe more cases of which I'm aware that Privacy International is involved in. I think Carly will probably speak about it, where our research is material evidence in lawsuits that are being filed or complaints that are going forward. And that's a bit of a challenge for us, actually, because you can say that, well, we're not an advocacy group, or we just focus on the research, but when you get involved in these legal cases, you actually can be subpoenaed. So it's a bit of new territory for us. Just stepping back, the final big comment I'll say is that it's obvious to me, having studied this area for my professional career, that just within the last decade, we've gone through such an extraordinary transformation in how we communicate, essentially turning our digital lives inside out. And many of us who are concerned about transparency and accountability, our primary focus tends to be the state and governments. I think that's very important, especially in countries like Canada and the United States, where the bar has been lowered, I think, and there have been relaxations around checks and balances that need urgent correction. But we need to apply those same mechanisms of transparency and accountability towards the private sector, because never before in human history has so much private information been entrusted to third parties, in this case, private companies that are headquartered all over the world. Those models of transparency and accountability will have to be different than those that are traditionally applied to governments. And that's where NGOs and university research groups working in partnership can play a role in a new model of distributed accountability and oversight, or civilian controls. Frankly, in some of the areas that we're talking about, in the area of surveillance and spyware, are approaching the area or the terrain of weapons. Many people use the language now, digital arms. And I think we're talking about what we're doing here collectively as a form of digital arms control to some degree. At least that's the way I look upon it. One last thing. In Canada, situation is pretty bleak, not only in terms of our government. I think your letter was so important in that respect because it underlined the contradiction at the heart of the Canadian government, where they can easily mouth one thing about human rights, and then when push comes to shove in practice, they do another thing. At least in the United States, I've seen some companies come forward ever since the GNI to start dealing with corporate social responsibility issues in a more transparent way. Transparency reports are very important. In Canada, no ISP, no telecommunications company issues anything remotely like a transparency report. So Christopher Parsons, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Citizen Lab, is spearheading an effort, a letter writing campaign to all the Canadian ISPs and telecommunications companies to get them to be a bit more open about under what conditions they give user data to law enforcement and intelligence. So I'll end it there. I'm happy to be tapped on the shoulders. So take my spot.
Start thinking about the way you're going to join in the conversation. Well, thanks very much, Ron. That's really helpful. Particularly this issue about evidence-based work, really cutting through the rhetoric, but then also those issues about transparency.
Thanks.
Great. So, Dan, you've been at the forefront of some of these same things that Ron's mentioned. So, could you explain to us from the perspective of inside one of these biggest companies how you've gone about it and what you see as the future of these issues?
Sure. Thanks, Phil. And before I start, I just want to thank you and Annabelle for the great work that the Center does, because it is a terrific resource, I think, for all of us as activists, for individuals, and from my perspective as a company, to help get information out and share information. So you really do provide a very valuable service that we're very appreciative of. And Ron, I think you gave me a nice lead in with your last comments there to talk a little bit about the work that Microsoft has been doing over the years. but I was reflecting back on some of the comments that were made during the opening session. And two of our colleagues sort of made diametrically opposed points. One was that there has been a lot of progress made since the first RightsCon conference. And I think we would all shake our heads and agree. But then a colleague from the European Parliament said that recent actions here in the United States is really undermining the very values upon which this country and this democracy and sort of Western democracies are based. On the one hand, you see incredible progress. On the other hand, particularly over the past few months or almost year, we've become aware of a very unsavory side of government activities. Ron, you were talking about some of the work that Microsoft and other companies have done accepting the responsibility to respect human rights. And I want to talk a bit about the work we have done within the context of a framework that I think provides a useful framework not only to companies but to governments. So there's the so-called Ruggie principles, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which I'm sure everyone in this room is well aware of. You know, they were adopted by the UN in June of 2011, and for the first time, I think really provided clarity or a framework, at least within the corporate sector, for responsible companies to understand what it means to be involved in work related to human rights. When we're looking at our products and services, what does it mean through the human rights lens? And according to the UN Guiding Principles, it means we have a responsibility to respect the human rights of our users, of our community, be they the hundreds of millions of users that Microsoft has or Google has or Facebook, our employees, parts of our supply chain. So after the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, we went about developing a global human rights statement. And I've talked about this on a number of occasions since we did it, and I'm often asked, was that a hard thing to do? And it was hard to do just because we're a large company where everyone seems to have a vote. We're a democracy taken to the nth degree, which is a good thing. But we adopted a human rights statement and issued it publicly in, I think, July of 2012. And that really put out for everyone to see our philosophy and our approach. It's on our website. I'm not going to bore you with the details of it. But it provided a framework for us to think about and a roadmap for us to think about how we're going to approach our responsibilities to respect human rights in doing our work. So the next step in our process, and I'm really going through this in large part for the benefit of some companies who may be in the room, not that we did everything right, but at least sharing with you how we went about doing it, and I will try to explain as I'm talking about it some of the pain points that we encountered. After we issued our statement, we went about doing a series of human rights impact assessments, where we looked at different parts of our businesses to look at our human rights, our policies and practices, and to make sure that they were in alignment with the guiding principles and aligned with our global human rights statement. And how were those policies and principles brought to reality in day-to-day practices? That effort lasted about a year and a half, and we learned through the effort that sometimes things can be written on a piece of paper that aren't actually followed in practice. So when I talk about a company like Microsoft and other companies doing human rights impact assessments, I think it's important to recognize that companies can do the work, but it's not work that is done and then stopped and put on a shelf. It is a continual commitment to reviewing policies and practices to try to check them against your global human rights statement and our responsibilities to make sure that in fact we are not only talking the talk, but walking the walk. The NSA issues have presented a particular challenge for companies like Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Twitter, many of whom are in this room, and it has been a very painful few months. As you know, we joined in partnership with, Microsoft joined in partnership with other companies to sue the federal government to allow us to be more open and transparent than we were allowed to be. We reached a resolution with the government that we are not happy with, but at least we're able to disclose more now than we were before. The companies that I mentioned have joined and formed a coalition to put continued pressure on the government to allow us to be more transparent, more open. And our General Counsel, Brad Smith, has called for an international convention to bring governments together to try to talk about a global framework for addressing issues related to government surveillance. So while I feel good about the work we have done, I don't think any of us in Microsoft are satisfied with all the work we have done. There is more work to do. I think companies like Microsoft and others in the room, and some companies that aren't in the room, have a responsibility to continue to work with stakeholders, work with advocates, work with individuals to lobby governments to make sure that governments understand they, under the guiding principles, have a responsibility to protect people's human rights. I'm looking out here in the audience, and I was remiss to remind everyone that Microsoft and Google and Yahoo were three companies that came together to form the Global Network Initiative back in 2008. I think it was a great and important step in the right direction. I'm hopeful that other companies like Facebook and hopefully Twitter and others will join the Global Network Initiative. I don't think it is the cure-all, end-all for all the problems that we are encountering and trying to make sure that freedom and human rights and free expression is protected online, but I think it is can be part of the puzzle for solving these problems that we're facing. So with that, let me stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really helpful, and a great example of the way companies are seeking to find ways, in a sense, to achieve a permanent emphasis on human rights in their So, Carly, can I ask you now to speak from the Privacy International piece, and particularly all the work that you've been doing on Big Brother Incorporated and the work on mass surveillance internationally?
Great, thanks, Phil. Thank you again for having me. Just for those of you who don't know, Privacy International is a London-based NGO, and we are primarily, in contrast to Citizen Lab, an advocacy organisation. And that's why we draw so heavily on the important work that Citizen Lab does. But we also do a lot of investigation, we do research, and we work with partners. I'm going to go through three of the strategies that we have fixed upon as means for enhancing corporate accountability for human rights violations when it comes to surveillance. But the pretext to what I'm saying should be that everything we do is collaborative. We work very closely with many, many other NGOs and research institutions and partners. We have a very broad partner network, so by no means do I mean to take responsibility for any of the successes we've had, but perhaps we'll take responsibility for the failures. So I'll go over three strategies that we use when it comes to surveillance technology. The first is litigation. So we do quite a lot of public interest litigation, and we are an organisation of about 50-50 techies and lawyers. We believe quite strongly in the important role that law plays in enhancing human rights protections and also in gaining accountability for human rights violations. So we try to find unique and creative ways to use legal frameworks to hold companies to account. And this is quite a difficult thing, actually. There's very few domestic legal frameworks that create real responsibilities for corporations when it comes to human rights violations. And at the international level, although the Ruggie principles were a really important development, they don't go so far as to impose strict obligations, human rights obligations on companies. So there's very little to grasp onto in a concrete sense. So we've had to find some kind of unique ways to litigate around violations when it comes to surveillance technology companies. A couple of examples of things that we've done. The first is that we've used the OECD framework for multinational corporations, which is a human rights framework that all OECD countries fall within. And under that framework, there's a a grievance procedure whereby individuals or organisations can complain about companies' compliance with the principles. And so we've made, with making very good use of Citizen Lab's excellent research, we've made complaints against Gamma, which was at the time a British-based and German-based company making and selling a technology called FinSpy, or a suite of technologies called FinSpy. And we made a complaint against them for the construction and sale of that technology to countries such as Bahrain. And through that process, it was accepted, and we went into a mediation process with Gamma, basically. And that was a really effective way of actually being able to meet face-to-face with representatives of this company and to talk through some of the really serious human rights issues we saw as rising from their business. And that is still ongoing, and the mediation was confidential, so I can't comment on it much further than that, unfortunately. In contrast, we also made a complaint against Trovacol, which was the German-based version of that, and that complaint was rejected by the OECD, so we weren't able to pursue that any further. We also made a series of complaints under the OECD guidelines against the undersea fibre optic cable companies that were implicit, or that are implicit, in the British government's mass surveillance program Tempora. So through the Snowden revelations, we were able to find out the name of 6 companies that are involved in that process, and we made a complaint against each of them, arguing that even though they may have been obliged to comply with the British government under British law, they should have pushed back further against those demands because of their duty to protect and promote human rights. And that complaint is kind of underway. We've not yet been accepted by the OECD contact point. We've also more recently done a different form of, different attempt to get legal responsibility of companies, which is we've written to the police in Britain asking them to investigate Gamma again for criminal offences, actually, under a piece of legislation called the Computer Misuse Act, which was designed basically to convict hackers of misusing computer systems. And we allege that Gamma, by designing technology which does exactly that, that is malware that intrudes into a computer and affects the computer system, they have committed a crime under British law. So we've written to the police in that regard with a complaint based again on Citizen Lab's research around the use of that technology against an Ethiopian refugee, a political refugee living in the UK. We were able to find out with the help of Citizen Lab that his computer was infected while he was in the UK with this technology, we presume by the Ethiopian government. So we're trying, and let's see how we go, to get the British police to investigate the use and sale of that technology. And just to address the questions that were in the outline, so those are some of the strategies we've pursued in terms of stumbling blocks. As I said, there are very few means of legal recourse against companies, but also the costs can be prohibitive. So when you sue someone, basically, you kind of oblige yourself to potentially take on a lot of costs. So that is quite a difficult thing for an NGO to have to moderate, and there are certain ways that you can do that. I realise I'm already going over time, so I'll try and speak more quickly. The second strategy we use is around advocacy and engagement. So that's kind of, like Sana said, engaging with companies, trying to make arguments about the reasons why they should preference human rights concerns over the sale of their technology, and engaging in things like the Forum on Business and Human Rights that Dan said, and in generally trying to push human rights due diligence as a really important means. Of course, when you're a company designing mass surveillance technology systems, we would say actually the product you're designing is by its very nature contrary to human rights. So calling for human rights due diligence in that respect is perhaps not an effective mechanism. And finally, we campaign for regulatory change. Again, as I said, we believe very strongly in the importance that law plays in controlling human rights abuses. So we've been fighting for regulatory change both at the international and the national level. And our most important work in that respect has been around what's called the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is an international treaty of 41 countries that sets out the list of goods that should be controlled by export control law. And we've been campaigning for certain surveillance technologies to be placed on that list. And in December last year, 2 were. including FinSpy, or a provision that will, we hope, encapsulate FinSpy and therefore prevent the export of that technology to countries where there's serious risk of human rights violations. And I think that that's going to be a really effective means of controlling the spread of that technology. So we'll continue to fight for greater controls at an international level. Of course, the international treaty depends on national frameworks being brought into compliance. So we're also doing work to try and get countries to change their own legal frameworks to control the export of these technologies. And just yesterday we wrote to every member of parliament in Italy, asking them to consider their own export control laws when it comes to hacking team software, again based on the good work of Citizen Lab. We found out that the Italian government have potentially funded hacking team as a company at some point in their lifespan. So we've written to those members of parliament asking them to take action in that respect. So those are just some examples of the strategies that we've pursued at PI.
Thank you very much. That's great. I mean, there's some really good examples there. First of all, that emphasis you put right at the start on collaboration. Again, I think it's been echoed across in terms of the way in which we can only deal with these things and be effective if we've really got multidisciplinary teams, often working across different organisations together. We've got the issue of the litigation piece and how important that can be. I love the case of getting the British police to start to really look at malware through that the laws against hackers. And then the importance of advocacy, really trying to ensure that we get the shifts by persuasion, but then alongside that, this issue for regulatory change and using the regulations that are available to us. But as we also know, there are so many gaps now between what was effectively a set of regulations for privacy that were based on, effectively landlines and letters, and now we have a completely different arrangement, and the regulation is so far behind in that sense. So now we move into that moment where people can start to come in to the conversation, and I really hope that you will not stay on your own chairs. I know there's a delight to somehow just stay there, but there's hopefully some of you who are burning to come in and join the conversation. But as part of that conversation, which will start, then others will come in. I suppose what I'd like to do is, there's some very interesting questions being put up, such as the issue of, excuse me, first of all, how do we deal with that first mover cost of companies who start to do something useful and then and potentially get hit by governments who don't want the kind of actions taken by companies to try to protect privacy and against mass surveillance? How do we make sure that also we're able to identify the key people in companies that can start that debate within the company, which can often be so important in terms of making real progress happen? And we've got, so that's and then this issue of well, we've got the first mover costs. Is there another one? And what are the real human impacts of content filtering in Pakistan? So again, those human impacts as well, I think, are tremendously important to any campaigning that we do, because we bring in that emotional content rather than it being simply about the URL filtering mechanisms that are necessary, which don't bring a public with us in terms of the immediacy, and goes back to that terrible moment in the speech, in Brett's first speech, where nobody cares about privacy, and I know that's something that concerns all of us on the platform. But does anybody want to comment on that in terms of those key elements of strategy and the issues of some of the questions that have come in?
Well, in terms of the question about the first mover issues of CSR and taking a stand against government, I can't really read the whole thing. I'm sort of looking at the question there that's in blue and trying to, I mean, as I mentioned, Microsoft, Google, and Yahoo came together in 2008 to have some initial discussions as companies with a number of NGOs and advocacy groups and academics and socially responsible investors, and that resulted in what is now known as the Global Network Initiative. I don't know that I look at it as a cost, or that we paid a price for being the first mover, other than there probably are some laggards who wish the GNI wasn't around because they keep getting beat up to join, not necessarily in our sector, but in other sectors. But I think it's really a responsibility that big brand companies have to be first movers. So if we can come together in partnership with other members of civil society to address an issue, in the case of the GNI, it was freedom of expression online, I think we should do that, because I think we can demonstrate by stepping up and taking responsibility that we recognize we do have a responsibility. You know, there was not a unanimity and agreement across Microsoft internally that we should join GNI. But I can say throughout the work that we have done in the area of human rights broadly, at least at Microsoft, we have had strong executive support, particularly from our general counsel. And that has been enormously important. I think it is very difficult for a company, and maybe any organization, an advocacy organization, if your board and your executive director are really behind the work you want to do, it's going to be very difficult to make any progress. So in many ways, I think I've been fortunate, and the colleagues who are here with me today who work on these issues within Microsoft are fortunate, because we do work in a company where we do have strong executive support, and we have board buy-in. We have a board, a committee of the Microsoft board called the Regulatory and Public Policy Committee that has oversight and responsibility for CSR issues, which includes, obviously, human rights and our GNI work.
Great. So in a sense, you've also avoided the first mover piece by doing things collectively with a set of companies, so you couldn't be, in a sense, targeted.
No, yeah, and that's a point. That's a really good point that I should have made, Phil. By coming together in partnership through a collaborative and through a multi-stakeholder group, we were able to address, and we are addressing, a very important issue, which as an individual company would be a lot harder to do, or just an advocacy organization.
Sana, I mean, your experience is also, in a sense, bringing in a number of different organizations, companies in Pakistan. Do you want to say a bit about how that multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary team was also created in your situation?
The idea, I mean, with the campaign specifically in Pakistan, and we've learned from that and sort of replicated it, was because, I mean, as I described previously, is because it's so difficult, dissent becomes so difficult, or even not even calling it dissent, like asking for basic right to information becomes really difficult when the state is taking a position where even the debate about getting Facebook reopened becomes, you know, are you with Facebook or are you with the Prophet? Are you with YouTube or are you with, you know, the glory of religion? So when it comes to things like that, the essential thing to do is to steer the debate away from the contentious issues which the government's trying to build, and to involve people like businesses, like entrepreneurs, like academics, to create a debate which government or organizations cannot refute. And it's certainly been, really helpful, because if you found a common ground and if you've written different arguments, it truly really helps in sort of making the argument much stronger. And then, would you like me to answer the following question as well? And I mean, that's a question that I get asked every single day. I mean, from Pakistanis themselves as well. Like, the country's at war. We don't know whether we're going to go after the Taliban or not. There's, the food insecurity problems. Also, why are you worried about YouTube? What good would that give? About the human impact of internet filtering in Pakistan, just last week, about roughly 100 protesters finished a 4,000-kilometer walk from a city called Quetta, which exists in a province, Balochistan, in Pakistan. Balochistan, I'm not sure if the audience here is aware of it. Taliban make a very regular occurrence in the news in the US. Balochistan, however, doesn't. Balochistan is one of the largest provinces in Pakistan, and there's it depends on what side you're seeing it from, freedom fighter or separatist movement in the province. which has been really, really brutally curbed by state agencies. And one of the most effective ways to silence any news coming from Balochistan is regulation on the internet. And in Pakistan, unfortunately, or fortunately, we don't have any mechanism in place, so we don't get to see what websites are blocked or what not. It's not like, you have a list of websites that have been blocked, so you stumble upon them and you find out. But one of the most pressing issues is the blocking of content from Baloch activists. Their websites have been categorically blocked. And just to give you a summary of what these blogs look like, they changed from just blogs about what's happening on human rights atrocities and what the separatist agenda is, to now just simply putting pictures of mutilated dead bodies that have been appearing for the past 3 years. And there's absolutely no conversation about it in the mainstream media. And even the 4,000 kilometer march that just ended was to garner global attention or public attention towards it. Hasn't happened. That's just one of the issues. We did a shameless plug again during the URL filtration campaign. Just to answer these questions, we did a FAQ, a top 10 questions, FAQ, frequently asked questions, and we gave some of the examples of how content filtration will impact. 3 weeks ago, we again put up a small sort of a research paper on blocking, internet blocking, where they're trying to block pornographic content. They've ended up blocking breast cancer research. So Pak PTA recently started blocking the term breast. I hope that they were trying to block pornography and not breast cancer research, but ended up blocking breast cancer research or anatomy of breast or prostate cancer in Google Scholar. So while you can Google those terms, you can't search them on Google Scholar. So these are just few of the examples of how internet filtering is.
So thanks for that. That's really helpful.
Selling a security within a specific state within the United States, and it would be paid for in the United States. The idea of somebody trading from Mount Kilimanjaro with Google glasses billions of dollars through Vanuatu back to London was not really contemplated. It is not contemplated by the securities regulations of most of the world. This had real ramifications when Lehman Brothers collapsed. And there are $1.5 quadrillion of securities traded annually, and derivatives traded annually. And what happened was this was litigated in New York, and a court in New York decided that the clause was unenforceable and the contract was unenforceable. At the same time, a court in England decided that the same clause was enforceable. The result of which was people holding $1 quadrillion worth of instruments no longer knew what they meant. And the banks basically walked away from domestic courts. And they created a specialized court in The Hague, known as PRIME, which stands for Panel of Recognized International Market Experts, with a group of panelists, which includes former central bankers, former general counsel of large financial institutions, former regulators from the SEC, the CFTC, the Bank of England, the central bank in the European Union, and others, Japan. And they are now moving these complex financial disputes to PRIME to be arbitrated in the Netherlands so that they don't have to deal with the haphazard regulatory structure that exists around the world. The solution, having worked on the Ruggie principles for many years, I think it's been about 12 years that we've been kicking those around. And it's very significant that they have now been accepted. The American Bar Association accepted them. But the UN doesn't really have what I would call an effective investigatory process. I was fortunate enough to handle the first investigation, defending, not prosecuting, but defending the first investigation that the UN handled under CSR initiatives. And as you mentioned, many of the things that you described about Pakistan, not the later ones, but the early ones, in terms of our regulators, the people in Congress, having no idea how to deal with the changes in the industry. And the industry will always move more rapidly than the regulation has the possibility to move. Leads me to believe that the only solution that you have on a global basis is what you have initiated, which is a compact, a network of the major players who will set standards Now, the irony of this, of course, is you'll always have arbitrage players, and you'll always have people who specifically are designed to avoid those standards. But only when you get buy-in from the industry on standards that the industry can accept, so that you can stand up to a government, be it Pakistan or China, and say, I'm sorry, we're not going to do that because that violates international protocols. Will you be able to have something that provides a near global system that you can rely on and provide freedom across the board? It's going to take tremendous courage from the company. It's going to take tremendous unanimity, which means it'll be very difficult to do. But looking to the United Nations, for example, to develop a similar pact, I don't see that happening. Politically, it's just way too much of a challenge.
Thank you. That's extraordinarily interesting and such an important analogue, I think, with the finance industry as well. Robert, do you want to
I just want to put in what I hope is a bit of nuance around the strategies of getting companies involved and interested in this area. I think, I know many individuals who work at Microsoft and Google and all of these companies, and they're all people who love human rights and care about free expression. But the individuals who work for the companies are much different than the companies themselves. And the companies really are highly unlikely to do anything altruistic unless it affects their bottom line. Which is why when we're talking about strategies, we can't lose sight of the fact that in order to get companies to move, we have to put a spotlight on things that they may be involved in that are in violation of human rights or bad practices generally are contributing to this area. And in order to do that effectively, I think the best way to do it is through, again, evidence-based research. So if you can shed a light on what a company is doing and the details around that are incontrovertible, as it is in the case, just look at the case of Pakistan. The government could reply to advocacy groups, you don't know what you're talking about. But when you show them that actually no, there's a fingerprint, technical detail here that actually shows there's no other company that's NetSweeper doing it, it becomes a whole different matter. Likewise in the other cases. The research is not trivial, and I don't want to sound self-serving, it's what we do at Citizen Lab, but I think it's important to emphasize in a community like this, many people who do advocacy and activist work and work for NGOs, the amount of resources that are required to do research in the area that we're talking about is a lot, because the technical details surrounding it require highly specialized skills. So I'll just make that remark. The other one more thing, and then we'll get off the stage.
Somebody come up now and get ready to
please
tap.
stop. I'll keep talking to the corporate sector, we need to differentiate as well within the corporate sector, broadly the internet, cyberspace, whatever you want to call it, because there's a big difference between the companies that are involved roughly in internet services and software and those that are involved in telecommunications. And then yet again, those that are involved in targeted surveillance and what we call digital arms. The telecommunications sector traditionally has been much more comfortable working with law enforcement and intelligence, and you'll find that they're very slow movers when it comes to dealing with these issues around corporate social responsibility, because they're very much embedded within the national security apparatus and have been for many, many, many decades, going back to the telegraph. And they've been highly regulated, exactly. And there's within Canada, for example, the telcos, CSIS, CSEC, our national security agents, very small family of people, and lawyers, regulators work very closely together. It's much more difficult to move those sectors of what we're talking about into a more transparent framework, let alone the other ones that spiral.
Very interesting.
Their profits depend on the market being opaque.
Yeah. I mean, I think, as somebody who's been involved in campaigning for many years, the point you make about evidence-based research is fundamental. And I always said to people, the research is the necessary but insufficient condition for change. Without it, you can't get the change because you'll be blown out of the water as soon as somebody can identify that you don't know what you're talking about. But the research on its own, there's plenty of absolutely perverse policy, and everybody knows it's against all evidence in terms of what's necessary. But we need also to be able to bring enough pressure to bear for the evidence to start to work, for outcomes that genuinely are about the common interest. Carly, did you want to come in on that in terms of your experience on research, or your experience also in terms of the regulatory side, sorry, what Walter was talking about on the financial?
Just to connect what Ron was saying with the question about the human impact of surveillance, actually I think that that's one of the largest challenges in this field, in terms of getting both change within the companies but also regulatory or governmental change, is putting a human face on surveillance. I mean, mass surveillance is one of the most malevolent but banal human rights violations out there. I mean, it is invisible and it is total, and it affects every single one of us, and yet for some reason it affects none of us because we don't see it, or we can turn a blind eye to it, or we feel helpless about what to do about it. And so being able to bring forward concrete examples of individuals who have experienced surveillance, have experienced negative consequences, or just being able to show the negative outcomes of these types of products is really one of the largest challenges. And having the research is essential in that, because the thing about surveillance is that it is covert, of course, so it makes us very difficult to advocate about why surveillance is so bad if we don't know it's there. As we have greater transparency from companies, as we have the important actions of whistleblowers like Snowden, we're able to illustrate better the practical implications of surveillance, but we really need much more data, investigation, research in that respect, in order to be able to do our advocacy job, I think.
So,
Yeah.
I was just
Go
going to give a
Linda.
shout out to Rebecca McKinnon. I don't know if she's in the room. She has a project called Ranking Digital Rights that I think is central to what we're talking about here.
I was just going to add and say I agree with everything you're saying. If you want companies to pay attention, come with solid research and case studies and examples, and that gets companies' attention. I will also say, just anecdotally, to the point you were making about real-life examples of human rights violations. I have the opportunity to speak in front of college and universities occasionally. And I recently spoke at a business school that I won't name. But I talked about our Microsoft CSR program, and I was in front of this class for an hour and a half. And I talked about everything from responsible sourcing to human rights to our employee giving program, everything. But I spent a lot of time on human rights. And we were 10 minutes, and I didn't mention the NSA, government surveillance, transparency, nothing during this whole. We're 10 minutes to the end of the class, and I said, okay, I have a question for all of you. None of you are asking me about NSA, about FISA, about transparency, government surveillance. Why? And this one guy put up his hand, he said, I don't have anything to hide, I don't care. I assume the government's watching me anyway. I mean, it was a really sobering moment, and I share it because it really bothered me, and I wonder if that, I mean, is everybody who cares about this in this room today? And all the students in MBA classes don't really care about this? But it was really a very, and these were, I don't know, they were 27, 20 to 30-year-olds, but they really had a very nonchalant opinion about the whole issue.
I think they've accepted that, but you have to also think about the LGBT people in Uganda, and you have to think about the fellow who tried to run a NGO in Belarus, where surveillance was the way that they get captured. Monitoring telecommunications, monitoring email accounts, and this is the way the government shuts you down. It's easier to say that it's not a serious problem in the United States, where for the most part the government doesn't really care. They have a very specific group of interests, people of interest that they care about. It's easier to say in the UK, where it's still illegal, but it still happens, where I live. And, but for the most part, it's true. I don't do anything that the government really cares about in the UK. When I travel to Russia, they care about what I'm doing. But they're wise enough not to interfere. But for people whose lives go on the line for living daily lives, because their lives are not approved of by the government, for those people, it's a very, very serious proposition.
I understand what you're saying, and I hear you, but it sort of bothers me that, is this what, I mean, where is this debate going to be in 10 or 20 years? And maybe, hopefully this was just one class in a business school that isn't reflective or indicative of the larger conversation that's taking place amongst graduate students, but it really concerns me.
Can I just follow up on
Carly,
that?
and then we'll bring
Very briefly, sorry.
Please.
I think, from our perspective, when the surveillance incurs two types of violations of rights. One is the discrete point of rights violations that you talk about, the violation of sexual and reproductive rights, free expression rights, freedom of movement, freedom of association. All of those can be born out of the use of surveillance. But there is also a far more fundamental violation there, which is our privacy. Now, the question of whether people care about privacy at all anymore is a huge one that faces us often. And I have to start by kind of rejecting the fact that, you know, kids these days don't care about privacy because they put things on Facebook. I think that that's a real mischaracterization of how people interact with digital services, how they categorize to whom they want to be private and to whom they want to be public. And even children, you know, teenagers who put everything about their life on Facebook will not let their parents see their Facebook page, right? So they have a threat model, but their parents are their threat model and not the government, right? So I think that we have to be very cautious about saying that there's a fundamental lack of care for privacy, because that's the argument that gets thrown back in our faces by the governments who say, well, you put it all on the internet, anyway, so let's take it all. I think we have to be more nuanced and smarter in our arguments, but at the same time I do think that there's a lot of work for civil society to do to really illustrate to people the importance of privacy, not just about their emails, but as a really fundamental issue about control and power, right? And so I think that is still a thing we're grappling with, and I think Snowden revelations have allowed us to start to have that conversation more. And we mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We must be very careful to say, we strongly value our privacy. We're trying to understand what it means in the digital era and where the boundaries have to be drawn.
Can I say just quickly that in Europe, of course, there's a much stronger sense of privacy than there is in the United States, where our Supreme Court in general and Justice Scalia in particular don't believe there is such a thing as a right to privacy in the United States. It's not in the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, that's very interesting. There's a fundamental difference, isn't there? Good.
Yes, very briefly, I'm the Program Director at Business and Human Rights Resource Center based in New York. It's wonderful to be sharing a stage with people who are working in this area from such diverse perspectives, and I think that's one of the main messages that seems to have come through this session, is that there can't be advocacy without the research. There can't be change without people advocating within companies, etc. So just to address a couple of the questions that came up specifically about the Resource Center and how we work, part of it is playing that catalyst role in terms of amplifying the voices of victims, which is so important in terms of changing public mindsets, and then seeking responses from companies when those concerns are raised. And somebody asked what constitutes a strong response. I'm not sure if it's there anymore. But it is interesting now that since 2005, we now have a record of about 2,000 responses from companies. Might be Chinese oil companies, they might be American technology companies. The responses obviously vary, but one is a very direct, honest addressing of the concern. So you can very quickly filter out the companies which say, we have these general principles on human rights, therefore we're doing fine. But there are others when they acknowledge the seriousness of the allegations and then obviously set out steps that they either say that they're investigating them, which is a valid response in many cases, or set out steps that they're taking to remedy them. And I do feel just the fact that there's so many of us here in this room from different sectors discussing this issue, that attention on the laggards and continued pushing of the leaders, because we call them leaders, but obviously all companies have challenges and they need that continued scrutiny, is only going to grow. So looking forward to working with all of you on it.
Thank you. So we've got 10 minutes, we hope we've got 10 minutes until the end. So I'm going to ask, if you could stay, I don't know if you'd want to stay. Can we get Ron back? Is Ron there? He's not at the toilet. Stay until Ron comes back. If we could just ask for final remarks from you. think the big, I'm going to bring some of these questions into it. I suppose looking at many of these questions, and please bring in any particular ones that you want. One of the things coming into all the questions which we've heard quite a lot about today is, you know, the model of change, to actually bring change within companies. How do we create the conditions where companies are prepared to come together to start to think about their own self-regulation? To what extent can regulation catch up with the situation? To what extent do we have to use many other elements such as advocacy, such as the legal system, in order to be, and popular campaigning, to be able to make sure we've got the pressure so that people can see the relevance of acting responsibly to their own bottom line, as Ron also said. So there's some questions here about, you know, should companies be required to serve the public good? That's about effectively regulating them. Do we know, in terms of the practices exposed by Edward Snowden, do we connect the types of surveillance practices exposed by him to the specific companies that provide the technology? Are we doing enough to, in that sense, name and shame, I suppose, is what that's pointing to. So in terms of looking at that, the broad element of what model of change is likely to be effective in these current conditions, can I ask for some final remarks?
I mean, I'll start. I think one of the models of change that we talked a lot about here is the model of stakeholder engagement, collaboration, coalition, partnership. It is clear that governments are not going to hold themselves accountable for the values they most espouse in their constitutions and in their laws. Companies probably should not be expected to hold themselves totally accountable. I think these issues are going to require a collective effort of all parts of the ecosystem to come together to have conversations, build relationships, and try to identify solutions. You know, Ron was talking before he left, was talking about the important part that research plays and case studies play. I think as I mentioned before, I think bringing that kind of information to companies and helping companies be aware of the real life implications of the use of their products and services really helps companies fully understand the responsibilities that they have to address challenges that, you know, honestly, they may not be aware of. So I guess the long and short of my concluding remarks would be that this is going to require a collective effort of collaboration between lots of sectors, all sectors of society, to address these issues in a meaningful way.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Carly.
To build on that, I would say from a civil society perspective, it requires a multi-pronged kind of advocacy effort, I guess, because it's not only about the companies, because I have to perhaps cynically agree with Ron that I think bottom line often does drive policies in that respect. So absolutely we have to talk to the companies on that level, but at the same time we have to educate the customers because they're the ones who are going to drive what companies do. And we have to change the practices of governments, both in a regulatory sense, but also in a best practices sense. I mean, the point about the surveillance practices that have been exposed by Snowden particularly is that those practices are being done by governments with government-built technology. But the fact that they're being done by the USA makes it all the easier for surveillance companies to justify selling it, making it and selling it to countries like Bahrain and Turkmenistan. You know, exactly the same things that the NSA are on sale on the private market for very cheap. And it's very difficult for the USA to turn around and say to a company, you shouldn't be making this and selling it to Bahrain if they're doing the same thing at home. So I think from a government perspective, there has to be regulation, but there also has to be some leadership and best practice.
Thank you. Walter.
I was thinking, as you were speaking, about the fact that we just lost Nelson Mandela and the movement that it took to bring down apartheid. And that was a multifaceted movement that was led by investors, institutional investors largely, pension funds, municipalities, unions, and a variety of others, a progressive sector of the institutional investors. And there is great irony when I say, at this point, I think we need to look to the corporations to provide leadership. We also need to look to everybody else. We have to find, there's so many regulatory bodies that talk about the concepts of corporate social responsibility. The ILO, the OECD, the United Nations, variety of other organizations around the world. But 10 years ago, few organizations had a website, a CSR website, that explained their philosophy within their organization. So now as corporations are developing those philosophies, the shareholders and the customers and the rest of the world need to hold those people to it. There are enforcement issues, but the enforcement areas, the regulatory environment are so ad hoc. I refer to Dodd-Frank, I refer to the issues relating to child labor, I refer to the issues relating to conflict minerals. Those are serious problems, but there's so many other critical issues out there that could have been listed had the regulators decided to focus on this particular area as a priority. So everyone has to be vigilant. Governments have to do what they can, but I believe that governments are going to continue to fall further and further behind because the Science and Technology Committee in the House of Representatives still is talking about creationism. They're a long way from understanding how technology works.
Thank you. That's a cold shower if ever there wasn't. Yeah. But thank you, that's really helpful. And I'd like to leave the last word to Sana, please.
Just to that question about Edward Snowden, have we done enough to connect the dots or name and shame? I don't think so, not at all. As a matter of fact, I believe that there was a very successful campaign called The Day We Fight Back, but not enough is being done to name and shame these companies and to truly make the mass surveillance issue an issue of human rights. Contrary to that, governments around the world are now replicating the NSA model. I'll speak about Pakistan. Pakistan is very happily replicating the NSA model. We're looking at a bill that will come sometime this year. We might hear about it if you're fortunate, about a cyber terrorism authority that the government is trying to build. We were fortunate enough that somebody pointed the lawyer who was hired to create that bill to us. He was under the impression that we are an IT expert consultancy firm rather than a human rights firm. And essentially he was tasked to create a document that will build an NSA-like platform under which everything to do with cybersecurity or cyber authority or censorship or regulation could be managed. That was shot down, but there's no dearth of lawyers working with the government, so we'll see another bill springing up. So we haven't done enough. In terms of, the closing remarks, or in terms of what we can really do, with our experiences and our own personal experiences working in Pakistan is, firstly, definitely need strategy. As civil society groups, we just get out there and feel like shouting off the rooftops is going to achieve the result. It does, but you need to know which direction you're shouting at, who you're shouting at, and what you're going to shout. So evidence-based research, strategy, and collaborating with unlikely partners. At times, collaborating with partners like we did with Business Human Rights Resource Center, or collaborating with maybe people within the government sectors who can build pressure. With the URL filtration campaign that I mentioned previously, the disclosure that the government had shelved their plan in 2012 came from an MNA, a member of the National Assembly, who was at that time a Syrian member. But unlikely partnerships within the government as well. And lastly, patience. Lots and lots and lots of patience is what is required. It's a long struggle ahead.
Thank you so much. I'd like to, first of all, if we could just give a vote of thanks to the panel for all the effort. I'd like to just close by thanking you very much for coming in, and particularly to Walter and Annabelle for also joining. And initially, we were supposed to have it in a completely different room. It was going to be all on the same, and then we were told we had to come on the platform, so it's changed the dynamic slightly. But I hope you still found it very interesting. I think from my side, it's just important that we recognise partly what Maraita was saying in the initial session, that it's the connectivity that the internet offers that is an enormous strength to our movement. that network society that we can create through the internet gives us a collective strength which we've never had before. And in a sense, I'm going to paraphrase one of the great quotes, which is, you know, bad things happen when good people do nothing. But perhaps what we've also heard today is when good people do nothing together, but they have to do it, if they're going to do it, with strategy and with evidence. So thanks very much to the panel. Thank you.